words.
We're back this week discussing Frasier, the 2023 revival, the rebirth, the reboot as everyone's calling it, even though we've established it's not a reboot, but I digress. Before we get into this, there will be some spoilers for the first 4 episodes if those aren't your thing. I wasn't intending to actually do an episode by episode breakdown of the show. I put out that video a few days ago on my thoughts for the first 3 and the show in general, and that went over so well, and I'm having so much fun actually exploring this show. I figured I'd do a bit of an addendum here now that I've actually viewed the 4th episode, especially considering some of my complaints and my problems and my criticisms were addressed at least to some extent in this 4th episode. So I will get into those. David. He was my big problem. He was probably the only one I would heavily come down as a real criticism from the first 3 episodes of the show. I felt that he wasn't utilized well. His acting was wrong. His character was wrong. He didn't really feel like he meshed or even fit into the universe of either the old Frasier show or this new iteration. He just felt wildly different from everything else surrounding him. And considering the fact that he was such an intrinsically linked character, he had such legacy tying back to both Daphne and Niles, these breakout characters from the original run of Frasier, he had this whole legacy to withhold, and he just dropped the ball hard on that. This episode, I'm happy to report, he was utilized quite a bit better, even though his character was really shunted off to this side plot that really didn't connect to the main storyline. But the way he was utilized, it did feel a little bit more down to earth. It did feel a little bit more fleshed out and like a real person. And he had little flares of maybe having something worthwhile going forward. So I'm hoping that this character can kind of come into his own and reconnect with the world of the overall Frasier. Now, I said in my last video that I thought Eve, and to an even larger extent, Olivia, were underutilized and hadn't had that much to do. They are given more personality and more worth here outside of the roles we saw them in before. We actually got to see Eve working this job as the bartender as well as the MC of the trivia contest, and she had a little bit more going on, a little more characterization, a little bit more outside of the single mother jokey role we saw in the apartments, and I did like that. And Olivia, she let loose a bit more of her personality, similar to what we saw before, but not seeing her as the Harvard woman, not seeing her as the head of the department over there in Harvard, really did feel a bit more earned and like less of a higher education joke, like she was played up the first couple of times we saw her. So I did like that they were utilized a bit more here. So the 3 characters that had the most to prove did get more to do here, and especially those 2 characters, they did seem like they were giving a little bit more to run with here, and I like their integration a bit more than I had in the prior episodes. That also brings me up to a bit of an issue that's running through this series right now as a whole. It isn't a huge detriment, but there was a couple of great lines and interactions between Eve and Frasier in this episode relating to Eve's history prior to the show starting.
You have made the greatest mistake of your life.
The greatest mistake of my life was not saying I love you to my boyfriend the morning he left and never came back.
You've made the second greatest mistake of your life.
She had this great line about that being the worst moment of her life and her worst memory, but instead of being a heartfelt moment like it could have been, it was actually played up as a joke, and that struck me a little bit like, ooh, that was a little off tone right there. Similarly, there was a joke elsewhere in the episode where Frasier met the new Dalmatian at the fire department.
Trust me, I have had years of experience. I outlasted that little mongrel, I'll outlast you.
It just hit a little bit like, ooh, I don't necessarily know if I like the fact that he's referring to this character we all loved for so long in that manner. I know the whole shtick of Frasier is he didn't get along with dogs, but I thought by the end of the series he had kind of warmed up a little bit. Those moments aside, I did like a lot of the interactions, which leads me to the locations we had in this episode. The bar, I think this was the first time it was shown on screen, at least to me. The bar is named Mahoney's. That is a fantastic piece of respect, and I really do enjoy that. And especially the way the bar was shot and framed in this episode just added so much more life and depth into this establishment, which I thought was one of the weakest aspects in the first couple episodes. It didn't have any life. It didn't have a Nervosa or a Cheers type feeling. The way they shot it here, it definitely felt a lot better, and I'm not sure if that was just because they were getting things things arranged in the first few episodes, or they kind of opened it up and let us see a bit more of it with the trivia competition as well as them sitting at the bar. So I'm going to go back on my statement that I do now think the bar has a little bit more of a let's hang out in this feeling like it did in the first couple of episodes. And I know I also came down a little bit against Harvard and the apartment, but we get a new location here, a better location, the fire department. I never thought that we would actually be spending a lot of time there, so I never actually thought of it as a viable option. The fire department sets they had here were actually really nice. I enjoyed them. I thought that they were great settings for future episodes as well. So I do also want to take back my statements on not having good set pieces and not having good locations. The fire department and the bar, both at this point, are definitely higher in my book than I thought they would be. And like I said, the apartment could grow and change based on Freddie and Frasier's relationship, so I'm definitely looking forward to all three of these locations. It does still leave Harvard feeling a little meh to me, but hopefully we'll get over that, and all of these locations will be fun places to hang out. Now, at the end of the Hailing Frequencies podcast, which I suggest you go check out, they brought up the idea of who would be a good returning character to this show, who from the sidecast of Frasier would be interesting to have back. They brought up Bulldog, and I actually do really like that because it kind of makes sense. It was mentioned in the premiere of this season that Bulldog attended Martin's funeral and sang Ave Maria, I believe, so that clearly indicates that Frasier and Bulldog are still on speaking terms, if not friends, especially taking into account the fact that Boston is a pretty big sports town, so Bulldog could come out at any time for pick your sport and he could show up for that. I also think that BB, his old agent, would be a pretty good contender for somebody to come back. Whether or not she is his agent, was his agent, however they want to establish that missing time, it could always make sense. They could write something in. And I would think that she would want to come back to Boston now that he's left his TV show. He's not doing any sort of career anymore. She would probably come try to get her talents in him again. Bring him back to TV. Bring him back to an internet podcast or some sort of vlog on the computer. Is vlog still a thing people do? She would definitely want to try and wring any profit out of him that she could. And bringing her in, somebody who isn't a family or a friend of the original cast, would definitely lend some more possibilities to the new Frasier cast because there isn't any lingering 30 years of history between them. All that I ask is that they don't try to bring back Lana or Lorna, whatever name she's going by now, or Kirby. I mean, I understand what they were trying to do with those characters, but they were kind of the dark point for the original Frasier, in my opinion. I didn't care for those episodes whatsoever, and I really don't want to see them back on the show at all. Outside of them, I would obviously have loved to see Dr. Tewksbury come back. Sadly, his actor has passed away. Rene Auberjonois has died a few years ago. And outside of being a huge Star Trek fan, I really did like that character for his couple of appearances. It added a little bit of context and nuance to the end of the original run of Frasier, so I would have loved to see that kind of continued a little bit. Sadly, that's not going to happen. And somebody that I feel like would be a great fit, and I even have a way that they could have worked it in, would be Norm from Cheers. Now, the problem with that is if you bring in Norm, you bring in anyone from Cheers, you have to kind of open those floodgates. You either need to explain why the rest of them aren't continuously running into Frasier, why he's not going to Cheers, why he is not talking to his other friends, and if they're not willing to establish that yet, which I don't think they necessarily should, because this is its own independent show, then having Norm come in would kind of be a little bit complicated. Sure, you need to do that eventually. You need to have these connections show up, season 2, maybe one appearance towards the end of season 1, but it needs to be an established thing first. But I, in my mind, have them just kind of showing up somewhere and Norm's just there at that bar drinking. Whether it's Mahoney's or another bar, Norm is just there and he hears Frasier's voice or something. I know it's kind of a cheap way to do it. That's just how in my mind I feel like that would work. I was also kind of a big fan of the Frasier and Freddie relationship, especially watching Frasier kind of get that little bit of growth in his character development and then seeing them come together a bit at the end.
You really want to know?
Of course.
Okay. Well,
It was just nice to see so early on that we're actually getting a little bit of movement as far as that relationship goes from episode to episode. And it was a nice touch actually calling back to those same fears we saw in the original Frasier between Frasier, Niles, and their father, Martin.
My father was a police officer. When he would work late, my brother and I would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if we'd ever see him again.
Now, as the father, he needs to stay home and worry about Freddie rushing off to save people's lives in fires and whatnot. I do feel like there was concerted evolution in some of the components. The writing was a little bit stronger, if not put together in the best way. The characterizations and the actors themselves feel like they were coming into their own a bit more and they were interacting with each other a bit more naturally. And even the locations were shot just a little bit differently to make it feel better and a little less artificial like it kind of did in the first couple of episodes. And I mentioned the laugh track. Somebody pointed out to me that it was actually a live studio audience. They weren't as noticeable here. I actually don't remember hearing a loud noise and recoiling at all in this episode, so it does seem like the show is growing into something. I just hope it gets the time to continue doing so. What are you guys thinking of Frasier? Did you think this episode was better, worse? Did you already give up on it? Only the future will tell what I decide to do going forward if I do an episode by episode review or something like that, but for the time being, leave all your thoughts down below. Like, share, subscribe, do all those YouTube things. But until next time...
You probably thought this all's well that ends well business had all ended.